Good morning, members of the public. Let me call to order the Post Commission's public meeting number 76. My name is Margaret Hinkle. I chair the Post Commission. Let me begin with a roll call of the other commissioners in attendance. Commissioner Bluestone,
Good morning, I'm present.
Commissioner Calderon,
Good morning, I'm here.
Commissioner Hall,
Good morning, present.
Commissioner Kajirosian,
Morning, I'm present.
Commissioner Luma,
Good morning, present.
Commissioner Talley.
Morning, present.
Thank you. We do have a quorum. Missing our meeting today are Commissioners Baker and Crispin. I would now entertain a motion for approval of the minutes of our April 16th meeting. Is there such a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Commissioner Bluestone, please.
Yes.
Commissioner Calderon,
Yes.
Commissioner Hall,
Yes.
Commissioner Kajirosian,
Yes.
and I think Commissioner Luma moved and Commissioner Talley seconded, so we unanimously have approval of the minutes. I turn now, please, to the Executive Director report. This will be made by our Executive Director at the beginning. Enrique, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, Commissioners. Before I share my screen, I want to start my report today by acknowledging a fallen officer. I'm referring to the recent passing in the line of duty of State Police Trooper Kevin Traynor in the early morning hours of May 6, having just moments earlier finished his shift. Trooper Traynor responded to reports of a driver traveling on the wrong way on Route 1. Very shortly thereafter, his vehicle collided head-on with that wrong-way driver. Despite efforts to take Trooper Traynor to the hospital, he was pronounced dead later that morning. We extend our deep condolences to Trooper Traynor's family, his friends, his community, as well as the state police. Trooper Traynor had 3 years in the force and was only 30 years old. I also want to mention the recent shooting on Memorial Drive that took place just a week later. State Police Trooper and an armed civilian who was later identified as a former Marine responded to an active shooter situation and were able to neutralize this chaotic situation within minutes. These two tragic and heroic incidents are sobering reminders of the hazards inherent to the law enforcement profession. And they come very close to Peace Officer Memorial Day, which was May 15. With that, let me share my screen and go on to my report. Can everybody see my screen? So again, as a reminder to those in attendance, the Commission does not take comment at its public meetings, but instead we ask members of the public to reach us by using any of the resources in the screen. Our website, mapostcommission.gov, has those resources as well. And we invite and appreciate very much when you submit written comment using any of those resources. On to my report, I will this morning provide a certification update given the upcoming deadline to submit recertification information for veteran officers with last names I through P, which certification will be expiring on June 30th. I will also touch on recent communications from the U.S. Department of State regarding something called a consular notification. And I will update you all on recent efforts of outreach and engagement, like I normally do, then turn it over to Eric Rebello-Pradas, who will provide a finance and administrative update. So as I have reported in the prior public meeting, the deadline to recertify approximately 5,000 veteran police officers, those with last names I through P, is July 1st and is fast approaching. In anticipation of that deadline, and as planned and previously communicated with users, we provided training and opened the portal on May 1st. The deadline to submit what we call the business license application, or BLA, is June 30th. Post staff recently conducted 4 training sessions around the portal opening date. Those are the dates of those training sessions. They were well attended. Approximately 200 individuals attended those sessions over the 4 sessions, with many of them coming in the first 2 sessions. There were questions about process, specifically the notion of entering information in advance to what we know can change soon, and that is typically the requirement to complete the in-service training, which agencies have, officers have until June 30th to do so. So we train people, users, to enter information when they have it, even if we corroborate the compliance after June 30th. Another aspect that agencies really appreciate is the ability to enter multiple officers at the same time, which is some of the many features that we have worked on recently, and we highlight to make the interaction with us via the portal a little easier. By way of reference, we continue to receive positive feedback on those features as people begin to understand and use them more. So as in the past, the certification team begins reviewing information as it is being submitted in real time to get ahead of what is typically a large amount of business license applications that come very close to the deadline. This slide depicts some preliminary numbers. We anticipate approximately 5,095 officers to be recertified. And the only reason I say approximately is the fact that in some instances, an officer might retire right at the end of, or really following the end of the fiscal year. But we have a pretty good handle on those officers which certification is expiring, and that is at the moment 5,095. As of May 18, we had received 1,282 applications for recertification, which represents 25% of the total. A number of chiefs also come up for recertification, 110 to be precise, as we have already received attestations from their appointing authorities, approximately 76 of those individuals. We also actively monitor those attestations for the end of the year for those chiefs. As has been the case in prior years, the recertification team processes and corroborates information submitted as early as it is being submitted to gain efficiencies on what we know will be, as I mentioned, a lot of information that comes very close to the deadline of June 30th. I want to move on to a topic of officers who retire and go on to continue working details. We have consistently maintained, given our read of the statute, that to have police powers, an individual must be both certified by post and employed by a law enforcement agency. From early on in our tenure, we have tracked individuals who retire but go on to continue being associated and employed by the agency only in a capacity of working details. We have instructed agencies to continue submitting their applications for recertification for all those individuals, as they must be certified by post if they carry police powers. Now, we have received some anecdotal reports that this requirement might not be broadly understood or consistently adhered to. And to address that possibility, we are planning on asking chiefs of police to confirm that anyone who they have doing details is either certified by post if they carry police powers, or do not carry police powers or a firearm if they are former law enforcement individuals, but no longer certified by post and working details. I want to stress that Our intention is not to weigh in as to who should be doing details or not. It is really to confirm that anyone with police powers is certified by post, even if they are working, even if all they're doing is working details. So the way we're going to corroborate this information is sending out a form to be filled out by heads of agencies, like we have done in other instances in the past, asking them to attest that those not certified by post, if they're working details, they do not have police powers. Moving on, I want to mention a recent request we received from the U.S. Department of State. Officials there, of course, and here anticipate a lot of foreign visitors coming to certain cities that are hosting FIFA World Cup games. In the next month, really. Foxborough, of course, is one of the stadiums that will be hosting several of those games, and officials here anticipate a lot of visitors to the Boston area. The State Department wants to remind law enforcement agencies of the requirement to notify foreign consulates when they arrest a foreign national. The requirement does not change how law enforcement agencies conduct their enforcement duties. It simply adds the notification requirement. The State Department contacted posts around the country and other offices asking that we send out this reminder to law enforcement agencies and make available a training video, again, also provided by the State Department, for additional details on the consular notification requirement. We have communicated this requirement to the Massachusetts agencies, and the video is available via our website using a separate password. I'll move on to some of the recent efforts around outreach and engagement. On May 8th, General Counsel Randy Ravitz presented to the judges and staff of the Boston Municipal Court at their Spring 2026 conference in Southbridge. The presentation focused on the Commission's structure, charge, and accomplishments to date, as well as the 2020 enactment through the legislature, established by the Commission and adopted various measures to improve law enforcement. Randy answered questions about the Commission's work during the 5 years that we have been at it. On May 12th, Annie Lee, our colleague Jim O'Brien from the MPTC, and I presented at the Martha's Vineyard Law Enforcement Training Council conference. As part of this presentation, we discussed the model use of force policy and expectations going forward. We also discussed updates from the MPTC and post. The post updates included reminders about submitting information to post. We presented certain statistical data about our disciplinary records, as well as reminders around submitting information on the recertification process. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we had 4 training sessions on the portal as we prepared to receive those 5,000 applications for recertification. And finally, last week I attended the spring virtual meeting of the Northeast Post Directors. This group includes post directors from states in Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, and of course, all of the New England states. These are great opportunities to share ideas, challenges, and best practices among post directors. These regional meetings are also intended to enhance the roundtable discussions at the annual national meeting, which will take place this coming June, at the beginning of June. I can pause here to see if there's any questions from commissioners or comments before I turn it over to Eric Rebello-Pradas for his finance and administrative update. Seeing none, Eric, I can continue driving. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Excellent.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. FY26. As you know, we settled on a reversion estimate of $425,000. Now that we're in the final weeks of the fiscal year, this estimate will likely be revised several times. Now, F&A and IT are reviewing contract renewals, which may impact this estimate. But nevertheless, we'll maintain the estimate for now as we believe it's still well within the ballpark. Post's Internal Control Working Group will be meeting shortly to review updates to the internal control plan. As you know, we update our plan every year as according to comptroller standards. We are also in the midst of completing the comptroller's annual internal control certification process to ensure that the commission is compliant. Moving on to FY27 budget development. At last month's commission meeting, we reported that House Ways and Means had appropriated $8.8 million, allowing for zero growth over the current fiscal year. So we requested the chairman of Judiciary, Michael Day, to sponsor an amendment on Post's behalf, which would restore our appropriation to the governor's number, which was $9 million. Despite our efforts, the restorative amendment was rejected, but at least Post is on record for, number one, keeping an eye on legislative activity, two, taking the initiative to proactively reverse any course the agency feels would hinder its statutory mission, and then finally, maintaining a consistent message from our testimony that we're trying to get to a number that is closer to our original request. So in short, we're sending a message that we're paying attention, we're taking action when absolutely necessary, and defending our position with consistent messaging. Moving on with the House activity, an amendment was filed which, if passed, sought to subject the Post Commission to de novo review. This raises the standard of judicial review for the Commission's decertification and 2+ week suspension decisions, and allows the appealing law enforcement officer to submit new testimony and evidence to the Superior Court. We did initiate feedback to the House Judiciary Committee as well as the House Ways and Means Committee. The language of this amendment could be interpreted as weakening the Commission's authority. Now, this is just another example of how we are paying attention. But I also want to point out that we do acknowledge that the legislature certainly has the full authority to render any changes it deems necessary to the Post Commission or to our mission. But it is important that we at least want to ensure that the legislature knows the pluses and minuses of any of those types of decisions before those actions are taken, which is what we did. The amendment was ultimately rejected. We did fare better in the Senate, at least monetary-wise. The Senate Ways and Means budget, which was unveiled earlier this month, matched the governor's number of $9 million. So we did a little bit better than we did in the House. Senate debate does continue this week. I do believe that it's probably going to end at some point today, but we do expect that $9 million figure to remain unchanged. Afterwards, probably next week, the appointment of the conference committee will be the next step in the budget cycle process. Next slide, please. Moving on to human resources. This week, Alexa Hyde was promoted to Data Analytics Manager. In her new role within the IT division, she will be leading data analytics initiatives for the Post Commission. We have some new members. Earlier this month, Keely Rice and Kathleen Veneri joined Division of Police Standards as enforcement counsels. Standards now has a total of 5. The legal division has accepted an offer in hand for the records access officer pending a background check. So we're hoping to have that onboarded very soon. And interviews are underway for the 6th intake coordinator, which is expected to be filled by June 30th. So should all go according to plan, we should be at a head count of 55 by the end of the fiscal year. And currently, we are right now at 53. Thank you.
I will stop sharing my screen and ask if commissioners have any questions or comments on any of this.
I don't think I see Any hands in the air? Thank you very much, Enrique and Eric, for your reports, and thank those members of the staff who have worked with you on the matters that you have spoken to today. Moving on to the next item on our agenda, agency certification standards. Let me turn to our general counsel, Randy Ravitz, please.
Thank you very much. And as usual, in our discussions of agency certification, I will turn the floor over to Counsel Annie Lee.
Thanks, Randy, and good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioners. So today on agency certification, I will be presenting two items. First, I'll be presenting further proposed revisions to the standard concerning internal affairs and officer complaint investigation procedures, which we call IA. Pending any final questions or feedback from you, I anticipate asking for your preliminary approval of this standard. And then following any discussion on the IA standard, I plan to quickly roadmap the next steps in agency certification, as the IA standard is the last of the 8 statutory agency certification standards. So starting with IA, this standard was last before you in January when it was presented for your initial, it was first before you in January when it was presented for your initial reactions and feedback. Following that meeting, we sought feedback from the MPTC and its staff, which resulted in some proposed revisions, which largely concerned reporting. Those revisions were presented to you in March, and at the time, you did not have any further feedback or questions. As is our usual practice, we then went back to the MPTC and its staff for further feedback and questions, specifically on the revisions that were presented to you in March. The MPTC did not have any feedback on those revisions, but did, at Commission staff's request, provide general feedback on a concept proposed for an inclusion in the standard. That concept, which is the basis for the revisions before you today, concerns the management of IA investigations. And specifically, it concerns the bifurcation of investigation and discipline responsibilities in an IA investigation, meaning that we asked the MPTC to provide their general feedback on this idea that the person who conducts an IA investigation should be different from the person who ultimately imposes discipline at the end of the IA investigation. MPTC had somewhat mixed feedback. There were some members who were hesitant about this idea, and they raised concerns about the economic and political feasibility of such a provision. Specifically, they raised concerns about not having enough money and staff, and concerns about potential community blowback if they didn't bifurcate as expected. That hesitancy really appeared to be shared among MPTC members from smaller and mid-sized agencies who really face more financial and resource constraints. But there was at least one member of the MPTC who was in support of the concept because, in her view, which is a view that we as staff share, the bifurcation of investigative and discipline responsibilities reduces the potential for bias and ultimately bolsters the integrity of IA matters, and in particular, the disciplinary decisions that follow. And so based on MPTC's feedback, before you today are two revisions that attempt to incorporate this bifurcation concept as a matter of best practice, while also addressing the concerns that the MPTC raised. A copy of those proposed revisions are available in your packet starting at page 39, and so I'll briefly highlight them for you here. So the first revision concerns the assignment of an IA investigation. Specifically, it proposes that an IA investigation will be assigned to an investigator employed by the agency or to an outside investigator retained by the agency who, when staffing resources and circumstances reasonably permit or dictate, is not responsible for imposing discipline. And so this proposed revision attempts to clarify the bifurcation of investigation and discipline that's already implied in the Commission's regulations at 555 CMR 1 and 2.03 subsection 5, while acknowledging with this language, when staffing resources and circumstances reasonably permit or dictate, acknowledging that agencies may face budgetary, resource, and circumstantial constraints that prevent them from accomplishing the bifurcation in every IA matter. Commissioner Calderoni?
Thank you. I had a question on that. Do you want me to wait till the end, Annie, or now?
I'm happy to take your question now.
So as I read the proposed change, I'm confused by it. Does it still keep the requirement that two separate people, the investigator and then the decision maker, is handing down discipline? Because I don't
So it
read it that
sort
way.
of states a preference for that presumption, but when staffing, resources, and circumstances don't allow for that, it provides enough flexibility. So it's essentially stating a preference, but not a mandate, because we understand that not every agency will be able to meet that mandate in every IA matter.
So that's the part that actually confuses me. I don't see how that's possible. So every department has a chief or a police commissioner. And from 3 decades of experience, I can tell you that the chief and the commissioner do not perform the investigation. So I don't see how that is possible or how it comes into play, whether it's financial, economical, staffing and resources, that an investigation is always performed by someone else or an outside agency. And then the chief or the department head is the decision maker on handing down discipline. So why would we weaken the requirement?
So I hear that concern. I think the feedback that we got from the MPTC, and this is particularly among smaller agencies, they provided an example of when someone in their command staff is the subject of an IA investigation, like a lieutenant or something. The captain may very well be the person who conducts the investigation and renders the decision. I understand that at least one chief stated that that was not their preference, but there was a different member of the MPTC who stated that that sometimes has to happen.
Well, currently in our regulation, we require somebody different other than the investigator to do both, correct?
I think it's implied, but it's not so explicitly stated. I think it's sort of presumed.
And this would weaken that presumption, this change.
This both states the presumption, but tries to build in flexibility for those agencies.
Okay, and I guess at the end of this, when we're asked to take a vote, can we carve out things that we're going to vote on? Because I don't want to weaken the standard, and I've been a policeman for over 30 years.
Absolutely.
We absolutely want to keep two different people. The investigator should be different than the person rendering down the discipline for obvious possible bias reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. The commission can vote on whatever it feels appropriate. This up to this body of 9.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks.
Commissioner Kazarosian?
Yes, thank you. I just had a question on the language in 2, where it says, which shall be an investigator employed by the agency or to an outside investigator retained by the agency. I just wonder, the word employed, does that mean they're going to pay us an investigator separately? It sounds like the same thing. So I'm a little confused by the language. I mean, investigator that the agency uses maybe in-house, but employed by sounds to me like they're going to go out and pay somebody, or whether it's within the agency or not. And it seems similar to an outside investigator retained by the agency.
Thank you, Commissioner Kazarosian. So this language mirrors language that's already in our procedural rules regulations, so 555 CMR 1. I believe this language is meant to refer to an officer who in a larger department may be exclusively assigned to IA matters. So if you have an officer who is staffed within an IA unit, they would be the investigator employed by the agency. So not necessarily talking about retaining a non-officer within the agency, but perhaps an officer whose primary tasks are investigation of its own officers.
I understand, but I guess I still have a concern about the word employed. It sort of suggests a separate.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe I understand it might be used by the agency instead of employed, but that word is confusing to me.
Enrique, if you're happy to yield the floor to you.
Would it be clearer, Commissioner, if instead of employed, it said within?
To be an investigate within. I mean, sure. I don't want to say it has to be within or without. I just want to make sure that if it's within, this makes it sound like someone is being separately hired to do this. It may be someone within the agency that's already got this responsibility of doing investigation, but this makes it sound like they're going to have some kind of, it's required that they have some kind of separate employment by the agency to do it. So I guess I'm not sure what maybe it's used by the agency, I don't know. Or be an investigator. My brain isn't working.
Commissioner Kazarosian, would it be more clear to say an officer employed by the agency?
Why can't it simply be an employee of the agency and allow for the discretion of the agency?
Mm-hmm.
That could work. Shall be investigated by an employee of the agency, I guess.
I mean, I think that's what Commissioner Calderon has been mentioning, right?
It's twofold with me, Madam Chair. I don't, if this is already stated in section 1, something similar as I heard, I don't understand why we're reinventing the wheel if it may weaken the process and decision maker, as well as changing the language that makes it very vague. I agree with Commissioner Kazarosian. It just seems like we're rewording it and then weakening the process. If we already have it, why don't we just take this section out, because it's causing a lot of confusion for two of us anyway. And that would be my request at the end of this when we do the vote, just to take it out. It's very clear to me that if I were being investigated for something, I don't want the investigator that is doing the investigation making the determination of guilt or not and then handing down discipline. Every single department throughout the Commonwealth has a chief or a head. That is the person that's responsible for handing down discipline. We shouldn't change that and allow one person to investigate, have finding, and hand down discipline. So I think it makes sense with all the confusion just to take that section right out and leave it the way it's worded in the statute now. I personally would have no problem voting for the other changes, but this is going to be a sticking point for me.
I think Commissioner Talley has a question.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with my colleague in that I'm looking for the value added of having this statement in there. I don't see the value added. Am I missing something as to why it would necessitate having this in there? I don't see the value added.
So I think the reason that we tried to add in this provision is that I think right now there's an argument that the current regs aren't clear on this bifurcation of responsibilities. And it is done as a matter of best practice. So it's a matter of clarifying this bifurcation, because I think that as you read 555 CMR 1 and 203 subsection 5, you could sort of read your way into saying that it doesn't have to be bifurcated. I know Commissioner Kazarosian had her hand up. I also see that our executive director perhaps has something to add.
Yeah, I just did quickly go through CMR 1, and it does not specifically require, doesn't appear to specifically require that the investigator be different from the person who metes out the ultimate discipline. So I do understand why we have to clarify that. I don't think it weakens it. I think it actually makes it stronger if that's the goal. I still do have I would like to just see the language changed about, as recommended by Chair Hinkle, dealing with the word investigator employed, maybe just have it be an investigator who is an employee of the agency. But I do look at this and I understand what the value added is. It would be that it would make it a stronger requirement, as much as possible, that the investigator be different from the person that imposes the discipline.
And I think we need to make that clear too, is if it's not in CMR 1 now, if you just looked at it, and we're going to vote on changing the regulation, then we need to add a line that makes it clear that the person handing down discipline is different than the investigator, regardless of whether it's somebody internal or outside. We should make that specifically, or excuse me, abundantly clear as we're changing this now.
If I may, Madam Chair, I think we can totally do that to clarify that for that requirement. which I believe was the original intention. Annie, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I did not attend. I heard from you. You attended the meeting or observed the meeting of the MPTC. Another dimension of their concern of smaller agencies was that they interpreted the language to always requiring them to go to an outside investigator for small agencies, which was the concern, which I happen to believe that that was not the intention either. That the bifurcation had to be, just as Commissioner Calderon is saying, the investigator needs to be somebody different. It doesn't mean that they always have to go to an outside investigator.
Yes.
Is that also your recollection, Annie? That was part of the.
I think that was the concern when it comes to the subject of the IA investigation is someone with supervisory authority, and the normal officers who would conduct an IA investigation are conflicted out because of that.
Commissioner Luma?
How do we address the concerns of those smaller agencies who may not have capacity for it to be more than one individual, but does who investigates and provides the discipline? How do we address that? So you think?
Want me to try to answer? Oh, go ahead.
Yes.
I could try to be helpful with that, Commissioner Luma. So taking out the language that we're all discussing, if we can word it in a way, I think that Commissioner Henkel and Kazarosian have it correct. If we can word it so that the department has the ability to either assign within or hire outside. The only time that a department would have to hire outside is if the second highest commanding officer, that being the captain or maybe a deputy chief, were the subject of the investigation. There would be nobody of a lower rank to investigate that supervisor, so they would go outside. Other than that, all departments have a command structure throughout the Commonwealth, so someone in the command staff could do the investigation at the direction of the chief. But at the end of the day, whatever the outcome of that investigation is, whether it's an internal investigation or farmed out to a private investigative team, a different person should hand down the discipline and be the discipline maker. If we can formulate language to that, it would satisfy not only what we're discussing, but the concerns of the smaller department chiefs as well.
And I'm also just wondering, kind of like, for the smaller departments, is there an opportunity? I don't know if we would be the appropriate agency, but do we provide technical assistance? Because I imagine that, we can't just have anyone doing investigation. There has to be some standards for the investigators to follow, and they have to be trained appropriately, I'm assuming, to kind of conduct an investigation. So I'm wondering, kind of, how do we provide that support to those smaller agencies who either don't have the capacity, infrastructure, or just the resources to train a new person to conduct an investigation, especially when it may be time sensitive?
Typically what they do, Commissioner, is they'll go to an outside firm, at least within the Commonwealth, from my knowledge that I see, is there are quite a few firms out there of retired state police investigators, FBI, federal agents, local municipalities whose former commanders, deputy chiefs, captains, that formulate these companies and do private investigations at the request of smaller departments and sometimes large departments, as we've just seen with the Mass State Police, who hired an outside firm to investigate a case, or the DA's office in Essex County. So there are a bunch of different companies and firms that are out there. I don't necessarily think it's something that the Post Commission has to be giving guidance on. There's plenty to choose from out throughout the state.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kazarosian?
Thank you. I was just addressing the first part of Commissioner Luma's concern, which was about how do we address this with smaller agencies. And I think that the language here attempts to do that, and I think does. It says when staffing, resources, and circumstances reasonably permit or dictate. So I think that language covers that. And I was also looking at when I read this earlier, and I made some suggestions myself about what that language. I was thinking maybe to be an investigator assigned by the agency, or to an outside investigator retained by the agency. That's the language I had put in my head, but I think we've covered that already.
Enrique?
So we can come back with language just as per the discussion, if commissioners would agree. We don't have to hash it out today, but I think we see a direction. I just want to mention this other thing. I don't know how much this happens, or if it was only something that happened in the past, but I remember a conversation in which maybe a chief from a small town, if circumstances didn't reasonably permit, instead of going to an outside investigator and paying for a private investigator, they will rely on a department from another, a sister neighboring town, and have some kind of either formal or informal arrangement, to use that investigative capacity, sort of regional type agreement. Again, I don't know how much this is necessary or still happens, but I know that at least anecdotally this has happened.
So is it the consensus then of the commissioners that we would like to have the revised language, and that we would address this then at the next meeting?
I think that makes sense.
That works for me.
Okay, and Annie, is that all right from your perspective?
Of course, happy to do whatever the commission would like me to do. So we can take off preliminary approval for today, and I can return next month with some revised language to address this commission's discussion.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. And then briefly, I'll touch on the second revision here, which concerns the validation of investigative findings. The language is what you see before you on your screen, and this is meant to ensure that investigative findings are sound and bias-free, so that any discipline that flows is similarly sound and bias-free. And so if there are any questions on this, this provision, happy to answer them now, or happy to just proceed to the next piece of my presentation.
I think you can proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Okay, and so lastly, I want to cover a quick roadmap of next steps. As you may recall, in June 2024, when we kicked off our discussions concerning agency certification, I presented this following framework with 3 phases: first on design, second on implementation, and third on enforcement. Our focus so far has been on the first part of this first phase, the development of 8 statutory agency certifications, which are, as you'll see, we have the commission has preliminary approved all but this final IA standard. And so that means that we are coming close to moving on to the next step of the design phase. And if you'll forgive me here, I'll fast forward through, just showing you all the standards that have been preliminarily approved. And so that means that after next month, pending any discussion or further feedback on the IA standard, I anticipate that this commission will be next moving on to the next part of this design process, which is focusing on compliance. As you'll recall, when this was last presented, when this overarching process was presented back in June 2024, I flagged a number of policy questions for the commission's consideration in standing up an agency certification program. The policy question I flagged for the commission at the time is, should the commission, in considering compliance, also take into consideration an agency's past compliance with other laws, rules, and regulations? So, for instance, there's a statute on the books that says that all agencies who have an SRO program are required to have an SRO MOU that is consistent with a state commission's model SRO MOU. However, anecdotally, we understand that many departments and agencies have not implemented an SRO MOU in accordance with a model SRO MOU. And so with something like that, would that factor into the commission's determination of whether an agency is compliant for purposes of agency certification? I don't have a recommendation or draft language for the commission's consideration today, but I wanted to flag this for you as the next anticipated discussion in agency certification. Of course, if you have any initial thoughts or reactions now, I'm more than happy to take those now because that will be very helpful, but also happy to sort of have this conversation in earnest in a future meeting. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie and Enrique. I think you have a question or a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I took a glance at some of the comments that people can do in the Q&A function, and one of them I thought was worthy of mentioning, which is if we could clarify minor matters exceptions to these to the requirement of maybe for small policy violations, whether the bifurcation of the investigator and the disciplinarian could would not have to be bifurcated in every instance. If there's given the discussion that was where did I figure I'd just raise it? If there's initial reactions now, we can take that, or also go back and, as we said, investigate draft language that makes this reflects the discussion, and come back to you at the next meeting.
I don't think I see any responses to that, Enrique.
Okay. We'll come back with a proposal that reflects the discussion.
So are we not now then, Annie or Randy, was there anything else that you were going to address today?
No, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you both for the work that you've put into this. The commissioners I know are grateful for the degree to which you've reached out to others and that you've listened carefully to the commissioner's response, and we look forward to addressing it again at our next meeting. I think with that, we are moving on to item number 5 on the agenda. There are no matters not anticipated by me as chair at the time of posting. Therefore, I would now entertain a motion to go into executive session in accordance with General Laws, Chapter 30A, Section 21A1, to discuss the discipline or dismissal of, or complaints or charges brought against a public officer, employee, or individual. Under the same statute, Section 21A5, to discuss the investigation of charges of criminal misconduct. Under the same statute, Section 21A7, combined with General Laws, Chapter 6E, Section 8C2, and to the extent that they may be applicable, General Laws, Chapter 6, Sections 168 and 178, to discuss matters relating to preliminary inquiries and initial staff review concerning whether to initiate such inquiries, and regarding certain criminal record information consistent with 555 CMR 1.104A and General Laws, Chapter 38, Section 21A7, combined with Chapter 38, Sections 22F and G, to discuss and to approve prior executive session minutes. We will be addressing in executive session standards reports of preliminary inquiries in 2 cases. We will be addressing standards requests for approval to conduct preliminary inquiries and/or impose a suspension in 3 cases. And we will have a suspension hearing in the matter of Dylan Knox, case number 2024-034, and we will address the approval of the minutes of our last executive session. Is there a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Let me then take a vote, please. Commissioner Bluestone
Yes.
and Commissioner Calderon seconded it. Commissioner Hall?
Yes.
I think Commissioner Kezerosen was the move on. Commissioner Luma?
Yes.
Commissioner Talley?
Yes.
And I also approve. Members of the public, thank you again for attending. We will not be reconvening after our executive session. Enrique, do you want again to tell the members of the public if they wish to communicate, how they can do that?
Yes, again, thank you. Comments, ways to communicate to us, ma.postcommission.gov or post-comments
Thank you, and many thanks to the members of the staff who have worked on the matters that were addressed today. I know I speak for all the commissioners in expressing our gratitude for that. Commissioners, we will take a 5-minute break before we go into executive session, and I think we will have resent to us the Zoom link for that, right?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you.